Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chaucer's Books virtual author discussion with Kevin Chong, the author of The Double Life of Benson Yu. My name is Mike Takeuchi. I'm the events coordinator at Chaucer's Books, a 48-year-old independent bookstore located in Santa Barbara, California, founded by our current owner, Mari Curley. To purchase tonight's book, browse other titles, or check out our upcoming events, please go to our website at chaucersbooks.com. While our guest and I are the only ones seen and heard on this webinar, please feel free to utilize the chat function located at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's event is being simulcasted on our YouTube channel and will be available to view after program's completion. And if you're watching on YouTube, please pose your questions in the chat. I will be doing that right now. I will be monitoring that right now. Okay. And there we go. All right, so let's begin. I've been fortunate to be able to read some great books from the Asian perspective. Just to name a few, Lan Samantha Chang's The Family Chow, Catherine Ma's The Chinese Groove, Tom Lin's The Thousand Crimes of Ming Su, and Jenny Zhang's For Treasure of the Sky. I can't forget Joseph Hahn's Nuclear Family, another book that stuck with me. But those are just a few off the top of my head. Along comes Kevin Chong's book, The Double Life of Benson Yu. It's a really unique story in terms of perspective, characters, and it really will turn you, the reader, on your head. But don't take my word for it. Charles Yu, the National Book Award winner for Interior Chinatown, wrote that The Double Life of Benson Yu is a nuanced, complex, and highly original novel, equal parts harrowing and illuminating. High praise indeed. Please welcome Kevin Chong. Hey, Kevin.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me, Michael.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. You've written 7 books, and your work has appeared in The Guardian, The Rumpus, and a lot of other things. And right now, you're zooming in from Vancouver, which I just visited with my wife. And you're an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, correct?
Yes, I'm an associate professor now. I got promoted, so that's good.
Congratulations. So what do you teach?
I teach creative writing, and within creative writing, I teach fiction and nonfiction, and sometimes a little bit of stage play.
So have you always wanted to be a writer, or is this like a dream as a child for you?
I'm not sure if I always wanted to be a writer, but I think I always wanted to do something creative and like that would allow me to stand out. I think, you just have this sort of youthful sort of self-perception of yourself, and some people want to be like firemen and businessmen, and I think I wanted to be someone creative. But I think that far into it, I tried things like being a musician. I wasn't a very good musician. I tried to can't really draw, so I ended up writing, and I started studying writing. And at some point, you kind of just paint yourself in a corner. It's like, well, this is what I'm doing. You either sink or you swim.
I got to ask, it's, many from the Asian perspective comes, you're either going to be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or a failure. And I'm wondering, what did your parents think about you when you started to pursue a career as a writer?
They were really supportive. I used to get that question a lot, and and I think it's partly because within my family, on my dad's side, there were a lot of writers, and scholars, and including I have a great uncle who studied with the Nobel laureate Tagore, or the poet, and then he went to India, and he cleaned Mahatma Gandhi's latrines and wrote a book about his sort of friendship with Gandhi, and he was a journalist as well, and so there was this sort of groundwork laid there. And I also think so long as I was sort of tied my writing aspirations to academia, I think there was that sort of safety blanket there. I was getting an MFA at an Ivy League school, which was onerously expensive, And afterwards, I started teaching. I guess like in my early 30s, I started teaching after being like a freelance writer for a long time. And I think there's like still a cachet about being a teacher, and especially being a university professor among Asian families that sort of in some ways cushion the disappointment of me not being a high earning dentist or a lawyer or whatever.
Professor is pretty good, so I have to say. Um, of course, you mentioned Ivy League. You went to Columbia University to get your MFA, correct?
Yeah, yeah. And it was, I think I was telling you, like I was 22, I did my first degree in Vancouver at UBC, and I hadn't like lived outside of my parents' house, and so
Mhm.
it was like learning to do the laundry and going to do MFA at the same time. It was really it's not an experience I would recommend for people. I would recommend like learning to do your laundry in year one and then living on your own in year two and then maybe applying to grad school. But I didn't do that, and a lot of people don't. And it's what it was.
Yeah.
And I think if I were older and had my wits together, I would have spent a bit more time in New York after doing my Columbia degree because I don't think I really made the most of it. It was a very expensive degree, and my parents were so supportive about my aspirations that they like remortgaged their house so I could go to get
Oh,
my MFA. Which is ridiculous. But they're very supportive in that way.
wow. You really did it, though. I mean, graduate school in Columbia and everything the gamut really was really thrown at you. But you ended up in Vancouver, and I was just curious why you ended back in Vancouver.
Oh well, around that time, like like if I had to stay in the US, I had to like get a job and find an apartment and like deal with my immigration sort of paperwork. And I just didn't have that much brain power in me.
Mm.
And I just sold my book and I was really excited about that. And I think remember when I moved back, I was like there was like a slight chance I might move back to New York, but I don't think I was ever that serious about it. I left like a lot of furniture
Hmm.
there in my Columbia apartment. I just abandoned it, and
Hmm.
it's ridiculous. Like retrospect, like I'm not sure whatever happened to it. Maybe someone reclaimed it, or someone sold it or something. But
Mm.
yeah, it was just sort of youthful folly. I
Interesting.
ended up back in Vancouver. It's a nice enough city, and it's gotten a lot bigger in the last 25 years since I finished grad school.
Hmm.
Uh, and it's more international and expensive and mean, all those things. But it's not like a cultural center in the same way that New York is. And so
Hmm.
in some ways, I sort of receded to the backwater, but it's sort of like where my comfort zone was.
Mm. Mm. When you said your first book, were you talking about the plague? Then was that your first book?
No, my first book was a novel. It was like a thesis.
Mhm.
Barocca Nova. It was my first novel, and it was published in 2001. You can believe it or not. In Canada, that
Oh
was
wow.
published in 2002 in the U.S. By Penguin Putnam, and yeah, that was a long time ago. It's like over
Yeah.
20 years ago, and I was like 24, 25 when it came out. And now I'm turning 48 this year. Like it's like it's a crazy. That I've been a writer this long.
So Benson, you your seventh book. Were they all novels or were they some of them nonfiction?
Yeah, I wrote three nonfiction books. I wrote a book. My second book was about being a Neil Young fan, it's like a music memoir, and uh, I followed Neil's road trip with Neil, like that he took like a long time ago, and then I wrote a couple of books about horse racing, which is considering I know very little about horse racing or horses, and people send me letters attesting to that. Like it's remarkable that I've filled up my lack of knowledge with two books, and one was about owning a really cheap horse for a couple of years, and another one was like a biography of a famous racehorse called Northern Dancer, who had a very prolific career as
Mhm.
a stud.
Wow. And then let's get to the double life of Benson You. And I'm just wondering, it's such a very unique story, but it's also very home-like to you because the story it's set in a Chinatown, and I'm assuming it's Vancouver Chinatown that you're setting the book in. Is that
It is.
correct?
Well, I'm never like specific about it because I guess my previous book, The Plague, was very much a Vancouver book, and people were talking about me as this regional writer, and I was like, everything I've wanted to say about living in Vancouver, I said in that book for the time being, and I also, like, I thought this book might have like a different reach if it sort of was an unspecified Chinatown. If it was, my publisher for this book is, a New York publisher, Atria Simon and
Mm-hmm.
Schuster,
Mm-hmm.
and I was thinking to myself, it's kind of like Schitt's Creek, which is kind of like a Canadian TV show that made it big in the U.S. as well, where it's never
Mm-hmm.
specified whether it's in Canada or in the U.S.
Yeah.
And like I think most of the cultural references are American, but there's something Canadian about it. Like there's like a niceness about it. And that was what I had in mind here, like in terms of just sort of having it in the sort of generic Chinatown, like a Chinatown
Mm-hmm.
that could be a Chinatown in your city or any city. And yeah, but Vancouver's Chinatown was what I had sort of geographically in my mind when I thought about the main characters. That's the Chinatown I spent my childhood years in. Yeah, with my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
And I have like a long sort of like I was born in Hong Kong, but I have a very long sort of family history in Vancouver. Like my
Mm-hmm.
great grandfather moved to Vancouver at the turn of the 20th century, and he owned a hotel near Chinatown in Vancouver. My grandmother immigrated to Canada before we did. Like I think my
Mm.
great grandfather had raised his family in China because
Really?
he made his money in Canada, but I think it was really onerous back then because of certain laws, immigration laws that were racist, and so he had to go back to sort of start a family, and so he had my grandfather there. My grandfather was this sort of like remittance man. He didn't work very much. He just received handouts from his dad in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
and he died like when my mother was like an infant. And
Really?
yeah, my grandfather, my great grandfather was buried in Vancouver in the 19. I think he passed away in the 1960s. And there's like a family sort of the family lore according to my mom is that we were cheated out of this hotel owner's like fortune, And so we visit my great grandfather in the cemetery in Vancouver, and we see like incense like that's burnt down and flowers like from the other side of the family that took the money, and so it's kind of like it's part of the family history that sort of like this great grandfather character, and then my grandmother lived in Chinatown. She's kind of I think we were talking about this. She's sort of the inspiration for my Papa character
Yeah.
uh, in Double Life of Benson Yu because my grandmother passed away 6 months before I started writing this book,
Mm.
and so in some ways, like she's nothing like the character, but
Mm.
like in some of the details about her, the apartment that the character lives in, like her voice, like the smell of sandalwood soap, like I wanted to sort of evoke those details of her, just to sort of like revel in them for a moment as I was writing about her.
It's interesting because, when I was reading your book, my papa on my Chinese mother's maternal side passed away 10 years before I was born. But, I always wanted to imagine what she was like. And when I was reading about the papa in Benson Yu, I was like, oh my gosh, this sounds like something from the stories I hear about my grandmother, that what my papa was like.
Yeah, well, you go to Chinatown even today in any city, and there's like a book called Chinatown Pretty in which they sort of take pictures of these like Chinese elders, and they have like a very
Yeah.
distinctive sort of look,
Yeah.
like a floral blouse, some sort of like knitted vest, something like mismatched outerwear, like my grandma had that look, and then when I'm in Chinatown now, like I'll see women from the corner of my eyes, like elders, and I think that's kind of like my grandma all of a sudden, and I think that's That's what's really nice about visiting Chinatown.
Wow, it's such a wonderful place. I'd be remiss if I didn't add, if for those watching, if you do go to Vancouver, go to Chinatown, but you should also definitely go to the Chinatown Storyteller. Was it Association? Is it
Storytelling Center.
Center? It's an amazing complex that talks about the Chinese history in Vancouver, and they just do really wonderful work out there. So if you could, extol them a little bit before we get into the book.
Yeah, it's a really interactive museum in which you can sort of visit and sort of hear and see uh, elements of Chinatown history in Vancouver, and they host some really great events, and they're part of really great multimedia projects. And they've got a nice gift store with, boba stuffies and dumpling
Yeah,
stuffies and books, including my books. So it's a great place to pick up gifts if you're visiting Vancouver. And definitely, I think one of the most significant parts of Vancouver is the fact that it's like a real sort of Asian, diasporic Chinese sort of hotbed.
yeah. You know what was I guess it shouldn't have been so surprising to me, but what my wife and I found is the parallel experiences of Chinese Americans and Chinese Canadians. I mean, they were just a few years apart. There was exclusion. There were, you know, pretty much they essentially went through the same as my ancestors did. So it was very, I would say, moving in that sense.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's a lot of parallels between like Chinese American and Chinese Canadian sort of experiences in terms of just exclusion, violence, like it's just a very yeah in terms of like the riots that saw Chinese people being sort of attacked for suppressing wages,
Mhm.
and to no fault of the Chinese, it was just these capitalists, and then
Mhm.
like segregation, being forced to work sort of menial jobs as being the only kind of way to work, and then all the way to this the model minority myth, and
Mhm.
the invisibility that a lot of Asians still have to deal with, in terms of the working world and in terms of the media world. It's yeah, they track pretty closely, I would say.
Yeah, which there's a lot of elements of the culture in your book, and if you could tell the audience just briefly, let's say you're in an elevator and you're going to pitch your book, and if you could just give a brief synopsis of what Double Life of Benson Yu is about.
Oh, the Double Life of Benson Yu is about a guy who's telling the story of how he was 12 years old, living with his grandmother in Chinatown, and he meets a strange guy who becomes his sort of mentor and protector. And as he tells the story, he keeps interjecting because uh, he can't help but to reveal that the story he's telling is false, that it's really sort of like concealing a darker truth, And so that's my elevator pitch that's sort of spilling out into a longer sort of ramble about how uh, trauma warps narrative, about how we tell stories that sort of build us up at certain points in our lives, but it's, when they're false stories, they kind of destroy us. Like we can't sort of live under these false narratives forever. At some point, it
Mm,
eats us alive, eats us from inside.
wow. How did you get the idea for this story?
I was writing it as basically a coming of age story, and I was really inspired by this great Portland writer named Willie Loudon, who wrote a story called Lean on Pete that was turned into a movie, and about a boy who's living on his own after his dad dies. I was like, I'm gonna write this like a Chinese version of that. And then at some point, like I decided the boy had to. I had only written up to like the halfway point, and the boy had to be sent to his dad, and I couldn't imagine how his dad would be so terrible. I built him up to be this terrible person, but I couldn't imagine how we would how I would write somebody like that. And then, as I was walking around the house one day, I don't exactly remember what happened, I just thought to myself, what if the dad was Benson? What if it's a different version of Benson? And then I had this whole sort of, this double layer of storytelling that sort of emerged from that. And so I started writing this way, and for the next year, like I had to figure out how to sort of set up the beginning so that the second part was not as jarring as it already is still in the finished sort of product, like there is a surprise where, and it's like a metafictional surprise where the character and the writer, they sort of are in the same world. It's a conceit that you have to go with that I don't think everyone goes with because it's not realistic. And it sort of stretches logic, but it's definitely something I really work towards sort of setting up by having the narrator emerging as a sort of intrusive figure.
That was like a mind blown moment that when you talk what you talked about, that the readers will definitely get a treat from. Why don't you share a little bit about it? It's such a wonderful, so well written, and if you could share some.
Yeah, sure. I'm just gonna start from right from the beginning, or
Okay.
I guess the second page, and I'm gonna read like 3 pages from chapter 1. A few days after I received that noxious letter from C, the boy appears for the first time. The picture fills my eyes, and the most expedient way to clear them is by writing it down. I see the boy on the street cowering behind his grandmother. That's his default pose. He's holding a fold-up cart. He's yelling Paw Paw and nudges him forward. Up until a month ago, the old woman pulled the 2-wheeled cart herself. Then one morning, after she'd been coughing through the night, she made the boy do it. On that initial outing, as they embarked on their errand running, she made a point of moving at her typically brisk pace. It's just my hand, she said in Cantonese, with a village accent she used only around family, like a pair of ugly slippers. It hurts, that's all. I'll be fine tomorrow. But then she asked him to pull the cart again the next day. Every week on Sundays, this depleted family unit makes the rounds to the markets for dried scallops, for pea shoots and watercress, for oxtail and roast duck. Everyone knows Paw Paw. She used to teach Chinese school to half of them in the church basement. Everyone stands up straighter, eyes jittering the second she appears. Whenever he's out with Paw Paw, the boy worries about seeing kids from his class. Their side eyes and smirks could strip paint. Those jerks will wait until they're in the schoolyard to tell the boy they recognize his clothes from gift shop clearance racks and church donation bins. They'll ask him where his parents are, as though he hasn't told them already. Now that he pulls the cart, the shopkeepers direct their attention to him first, as the person who handles the business. They all know better than to see him as in charge. This way, they don't have to meet the gaze of the woman who had picked their Chinese name from a roll to recite classical poetry. Today, it's Mr. Ma who runs a convenience store across the street. Die low, he says from the back of the store. He's finished stacking cans of the soup. How may we serve you, he says in Cantonese. Paw Paw tuts, her voice like the rasp she uses on her feet before bedtime, allows the boy, I guess we're going to call him Benny, to choose a shrink-wrap package of snack cakes for acing his math test. One indulgence he's earned from pulling the cart is getting to stop here first. He no longer has to wait until their errands are done for his weekly treat. You're acting as though he's the one paying for everything, she reminds Mr. Ma. One day he will. Big head, big brain, wah, says Mr. Ma, rubbing his hands on his flannel shirt sleeves as he follows them to the front of the store. The sides of his face are crinkled from all the smiling he does. His daughter sits behind the cash register. Benny's cheeks warm at the sight of the girl. I cringe to picture him this way, fluorescent with hormonal yearning around Mr. Ma's daughter, Shirley. I've changed her name, though the real one is pretty similar. Only a few years ago, Benny and Shirley did everything together, watching TV, playing Transformers, drawing, even eating on most days in the same bowl of macaroni, peas, and ham and broth, back when his mother had grown too weak to work and babysat her for extra cash. Now he can't speak to her. Why can't I have at least one smart child, La? Some shopkeeper says to her. Shirley's older brother works at the store when forced, but otherwise runs with the wrong kids. The ones who wear clothes their parents can't afford. Look at him, Mr. Ma tells his daughter, always on my roll. Nose and books, team. He takes after his grandmother, Shirley says in English, staring at her lap. She struggles to wipe her mouth clean of a smirk. She has an oblong face with wide cheekbones and tendrils of hair that escape from her ponytail. Her bright eyes and a readily pursed expression complement a thorny demeanor that the boy will always be drawn to. Look who I have to take after. Mr. Ma wagged open palm at her, his eyes glinting with amusement, begging to be hated. Pawpaw slides cupcakes across the counter, produces a folded $5 bill from the lanyard money pouch, which he keeps for seniors' bus pass. Shirley opens the register and calculates the change in her head. Your girl is even better with numbers than my grandson, Gua, Papa says. Every child has a different strength. The shopkeeper seems stumped by this praise from a woman who offers so little of it. Praise from her always feels unprecedented. As they're leaving, Mr. Ma gathers his wits and holds out a candy bar. Benny stares at the treat, Flake. He's never heard the name before. It's probably chocolate. It's probably good. It's free. But why can't it just be a normal candy bar, a Snickers or a Mars bar, and not something that came over on a boat? A gift for Dilo, Mr. Ma says to Papa, free of charge. Nonsense, Papa says, and hands Benny 2 quarters to pay for it. Shirley reaches out. He wishes his fingertips weren't so grimy as they glance along her palm. She turns away when she takes the money. Benny eats the snack cakes once they step outside, eats them so fast as though he's trying to hide them from himself. Papa would chide him for eating so quickly, except that she's in a hurry. He'll save the candy bar for later. That shopkeeper doesn't pay taxes, Wool. That's why his girl was so good at numbers. Don't tell her you know all of that, La, Papa says to him once they reach the next block. Why were you standing around acting so dopey around Mr. Ma? I wasn't, Benny insists, moving a step ahead of her down the hill to the first stop. At night, he will picture Benny, Shirley, the way she flutters her eyelashes and tucks in the left corner of her mouth when she's embarrassed. He sits behind her in their history and English blocks, so you can watch her ponytail sway for up to 2 hours a day. They pick up vegetables at a greengrocer, chicken feet at the butcher shop. The people at those stores don't fawn over him as much. At the butcher's, Pawpaw slips on the wet linoleum but reaches for the counter to prevent a fall. Throughout their walk, the big hill back to the cream-colored concrete housing development looms for Benny. The first few days pulling the cart were muscle-scorching slogs, ones that underscored his softness, and he wondered how Pawpaw managed that task all these years. But the sum of that effort has made him more resolute, not stronger. Today he feels as though he can sail up that hill. When he turns around to see Pawpaw midway down the block, her body seems to be twisting, hands aloft like a surfer along a concrete wave. She clamps a handkerchief to a face that's purple with distress. As Benny starts to hurry back, the cart turns over. Stooping over to pick up the scattered groceries on the sidewalk, he sees Pawpaw reaching for a lamppost but missing it, then crashing. Thanks.
Wow, that's great. A lot of action there, but what I like is how you really put us in that place and really set us up. But we still don't know what's going to happen. We have no clue what's going to be happening next. And but I would like you to talk a little bit about your characters, Benny and Benson, I should say.
Well, Benny's 12, and I think of that sort of as a good age to have the character sort of be who he is, because he's sort of somewhere between sort of innocent and experienced, like he's childlike in a lot of ways, and he still likes comic books. I remember it being the age where you're not sure whether or not you should keep playing with toys, and you're at that age where you want to be doing things, you go out with your friends, but you're stuck at home watching the Golden Girls on a Friday night. That was what it was like for me as a 12-year-old. And he's a little embarrassed about, his family situation and just living with his grandma. And he's very self-conscious. And I think he's very vulnerable too. He just lives with his grandmother. He doesn't have a lot of sort of oversight in his life. And that's how he meets, this guy named Constantine.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other end of it, you have Benson Yu, who's like a writer in his mid-40s. I have him as a graphic novelist. And he, like in the 90s, he kind of created this sort of cartoon character, Iggy Samurai, that was sort of like, my version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or Usagi Yojimbo.
Usagi,
And so like he's a samurai lizard, and that was his first attempt at trying to like turn the childhood abuse that he experienced with his mentor figure into like a wholesome story. And it served him, it made him popular for a while. but he still sort of suffers from a lot of those demons. He's filled with self-loathing. He drinks too much. He's distracted as a parent and as a spouse. He lives in a college town with his wife, who's a professor, and he's trying to retell his story of his youth, and he keeps trying to like change it, and so he's somebody who's still grappling with the trauma of his childhood.
You had mentioned Constantine as well. If you can bring Constantine in, and he plays a critical role in this book.
Yeah. He, like, the first half of this book, it alternates from the point of view of Benny and the point of view of Constantine. And Constantine's this sort of mentally ill man who thinks that he's a reincarnated samurai, and he's also good at martial arts, like karate, and he reluctantly takes on Benny as his sort of roommate and as his student. And I kind of picture him as sort of, in my mind when I was writing him, as like that kind of like that Billy Bob Thornton character in Sling Blade, like that big sort of oaf who doesn't have a lot of sort of a social sort of guile, and he is in Benson's mind like a benign version of this person that abused him. He's trying to rewrite the past and tell a story. And so Constantine is like the sort of like friendly version of this real life abuser in his own life, who Benson is trying to avoid, but eventually kind of confronts.
It seems like I don't think this is the revealing way of saying that Benson is trying to control a narrative, but it's going to get away from it.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I'm trying to word it so not to spoil anybody, but as far as what you were writing this character and the story getting away, this narrative getting away from Benson, and with Benny, was that a challenge for you to rein everything back in, or did the story itself want to try to get away from you, the writer?
I feel like the story got away from me like many times, as the writer of this story within a story, like the story has two parts, and I remember when I first wrote it, I had like a third part, and I completely scrapped it because the original third part didn't work, and then I wrote a new third part, and so that was one way it got away from me. And then earlier I talked about how the story surprised me in terms of it being a story within a story, and there were just different points where you sort of imagine your story going in a certain way and the characters going a certain way, but once you start writing these characters, they have this momentum, and it doesn't make sense for the story to move in one direction. It moves in another direction instead.
I imagine the first draft was it went pretty fast for you when you wrote, when you first started writing. How long I'm pretty sure you wrote this during the pandemic, so how long did it take you to write that first draft then?
Most of my first drafts I do pretty quickly. I don't know people write books and they take 10 years to do it, but for me, a first draft usually takes 3 to 6 months. This one took about 3 months. I start writing a book, like maybe 500 words a day, and then at some point you kind of know you're going to finish it. Like I start a lot of things and I don't finish them. And especially novels. And at some point it is, and then you just sort of move from 500 words a day to like 1,000 words a day, and then there's like this frantic dash when you're like, I don't know, with the last 20 or 50 or 20 pages, where you're just like trying to write as much as possible. You just still want the book to be done. Like you want to finish a draft. You want that integrity of a book having a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you have these irrational fears. I know I've talked to other writers about this too, where like when you're writing a book and you're almost done, you're afraid that you'll be hit by a bus or something that'll happen. You won't be able to finish your book. And it's silly. It doesn't matter. Like you should always be cautious of buses in coming in your way. You should always be.
Mhm.
I don't think you need to be that paranoid about your personal safety. But that's just kind of a
Mhm.
thought to enter my head when I'm almost done a book.
Mm. I have a few more questions. So if you have anybody out there in the audience has questions, please feel free to type them in. Um, Somebody had called your story a mind bender, and I completely agree because you really, although you tell a wonderful story, the reader has to be more active reading your book than they would just a straight linear story. And I say that in the most complimentary sense. I really like how books can really work certain parts of your mind and why you're reading them. And I was wondering, how were you able to write in that style? It's so unique and it's so difficult to do, so difficult to pull off.
I'm not sure exactly. I think it's the first book that has that sort of twisty element to it. And there are books that I really admire that do that stuff. And like I'm thinking of many things by Ian Reid, like
Mhm.
Trust Exercise by Susan Choi
Yeah,
are two books that really come to mind. Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu.
yeah.
And I didn't set out to do it. I kind of just sort of like stumbled onto this sort of tricky book, and
Yeah.
I read books like most of the time, like before I fall asleep, and so like I'm not like that alert. So I totally sympathize with people who don't want a mind bending book and don't want to work to understand a story, like, or like, and like there's some books that you have to read a second time to fully get, and
Hmm.
I never want to read those books a second time, to be honest. I think that's really hard. I think it's really asking a lot of a reader to do that. So, like writing a book that requires work, I know I did that, and I like
Uh-huh.
books that are like that, but I also like books that are straightforward, and so yeah, it's one of those things I kind of just stumbled onto.
It, it must have been really fun to write, though. I have to comment.
Yeah, yeah. You know what? One of the things that really influenced me was that like it was right before the pandemic, and I just got in this weird kick of like watching samurai movies, and I just wanted to write like a book that had like a samurai like sword fight at the end, like a duel, like I knew
Hmm.
that was an element that was going to be in the book, and I'm glad I did that. It's really cool. Like I really, it's in one way it's like that martial arts and the sword fighting is like an expression of I think toxic masculinity, especially as experienced by Asians, like Asian
Hmm.
males in North America, who don't see themselves represented in a way that's very sort of masculine and bold. And so they look at things like martial arts and
Hmm.
samurai movies for that. And it's toxic, I think, but it's also I think it's still kind of cool too. I love those movies. I think they're amazing.
I think you'd mentioned Toshiro Mifune in the book about not being able to get the one expression correct. And
Yeah.
um, so growing up, did you watch a lot of these movies? And
Oh yeah, yeah. Like growing up, I watched a lot of martial arts movies. Like my parents had like a VHS and a Betamax, and we just watched. We just got like my mom just kept getting like movies. Like that was her connection to like Hong Kong culture. Just all the videos that she would sort of end up with like every week, all her soap operas and things. And there was like a Chinese movie theater in Chinatown back then, the Golden Harvest. And I remember seeing John Woo's A Better Tomorrow there. That's not
oh,
martial arts, but it's
yeah,
like macho Chinese guys,
yeah.
like in such a signature movie with Chow Yun Fat. And so yeah, I do have a lot of those memories growing up watching Chinese media. Yeah.
It's interesting. Were you able to get hold of like the Bruce Lee, like the Big Boss and things like that?
Oh yeah, I watched them all. And I reviewed like the Matthew Polly biography of him for a British newspaper like a few years back. So I revisited all the Bruce Lee movies, and that's really interesting. And then I read a book by Daryl Maeda, like a
Oh yeah,
Asian studies scholar, like Water, that was really good. And it
yeah,
talked about Bruce Lee through the kind of this transnational perspective.
yeah.
It really
Likewise.
opened my eyes about like how ahead of his time Bruce Lee was in terms of sort of moving away from these sort of like ideas of borders and ideas of sort of distinct styles, which are in oppressive structures in a lot of ways.
Hmm. I really enjoyed Daryl Maeda's book. I highly recommend anybody to read that. It's a great cultural commentary on the phenomenon that was Bruce Lee.
Yeah, there's a lot of great background about like Chinese opera in California in the 19th
Yeah,
century, the movie business. It's in some ways an academic book, but it's really interesting and compelling because it sort of uh, makes you look at Bruce Lee in a new way.
yeah, yeah. It's in terms of sharing your culture and your personal. I mean, I want to get back to your papa a little bit. She had passed away right before when you were writing this, correct? And
Yes.
and I was just wondering, you know, obviously that had an influence on you, but I'm just wondering if you felt a voice or you felt a feeling of her when you were writing those parts about Papa. And
Are in some ways, yeah. Like I'm always trying to like summon the physical details. You kind of want like you kind of want to be in the moment with your characters, or I want to be in the moments with my characters, and so
Mhm,
I'll have like very fictionalized situations, but like all my situations in my novels are pretty much fictionalized, but I'll have them set in places that I lived in. Like I'll have them set in like apartments that I lived in, or I'll have characters who share similarities with me. Someone who was like 12 in 1987. Like I'll have that
mhm,
character. Like so I know how the character feels in that moment in time. Like I like having that as a kind of like a starting point. Like you want to be able to relate to your characters in a way, and you want to be able to feel the things they feel. And doing things like that just sort of is like a little bit of a little bit of like a helper.
mm, mm. So a book like this is very unique, and uh, something like, let's say, for comparison of uniqueness is Charles Yu's Interior Chinatown. But I was wondering if was it hard to sell this book to your publisher?
It wasn't, like that was really surprising. Like in some ways it caught me off guard. Like I have a great editor at Atria, Lonely, and maybe because she's Asian American as well. Uh, she like I remember we sent it out, and I was I was not necessarily that optimistic that I would like sell to a major publisher, but I think within a week and a half there was a meeting set up with her, and she made an offer at by the end of that week, and so that moved really quickly. In some ways it surprised me. Like, and in some ways it's sort of atypical. Like we tried to sell this book internationally, and I don't think it's
Mm,
sold yet, as far as I know. And
mhm.
unless like my agent's hiding something from me, which I don't think they are. Uh, so that caught me. Like, it hasn't sold like TV or film rights yet. So that the initial response was really quick, and I was really surprised by that.
That's great. And so what's next for you then?
I don't know, to be honest. Like I started something like a year and a half ago about based on sort of Chinese like spiritual practices. I don't normally talk about what I'm writing, but I think it's something I'm moving
Ah,
behind. And I have like it was a novel about this deceased woman living in a Chinese version of the afterlife, which is sort of like our own life, you know. But if she's running out of money, because if you're like a Chinese person, your descendants need to like burn paper money, like ghost money, to like fund the lifestyles of your ancestors, and she's running out of money, so she has to like return to the living world to like convince her estranged son to make a contribution at her gravesite, and that was the book I was working on. But I hit like a point in the book where I just didn't know where to go with it, and I haven't returned to it since. It's been about a year now, so I don't know what I'm gonna do next, to be honest. Like I'm casting about, like if you got suggestions or anyone watching this has suggestions, I'm open to them.
Well, I want to buy that book that you just described, so maybe you should revisit it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try my best.
Just along that lines, we've got a couple more minutes if anybody has any questions. But how long do you stick with a story when you write? And does it just run its course that you are ready to move on, or you give it a certain amount of time?
I don't know. I don't have any set like guidelines. I think that at some point there's something that catches, like when you're writing something, like and it's like you have this sort of wind on your back, and you're like taking off, you're flying, like, and you wait for that experience. You sort of like putter along with it, and then at some point, it catches, and if it doesn't, you can struggle with it. And I've written entire manuscripts where like I'm waiting for that moment to come where like it makes sense to me, and the book has its own sort of integrity, and it's not being propped along by me. Like the story, like at some point when you're writing something, you feel like the story tells itself. And when it doesn't happen, when you're working on it and you're waiting for the story to tell you what happens next, and it doesn't tell you, then at some point you just have to like step away from it. And if it returns to you, that's great. If you have to come back to it, that's great. But if you don't come back to it, like then it's time to move on, I think.
Um, we got a question here, but I want to ask you one more question along that line. As far as when you got to Double Life Events, and when you got to that point when you knew, being a writer who has yet to be published, I don't know that feeling yet. So I'm wondering if you could just describe that feeling of when you had something with Double Life Events in you.
Like I think I talked about, like knowing when you're going to finish it. I think that's something. And I think that was something that was exciting. And then like when I had that sort of idea that it's a story within a story,
yeah,
I thought that was kind of cool. I thought that was kind of interesting, like that, like I've always wanted to write one of those twisty sort of like mind-bending novels, but I could never get to that mind-bending part or how to do it, like I wanted, and I sort of again stumbled onto it. And so I don't know, like, to be honest, like whether or not, my idea of I've got something really translates into like whatever like you would define as a something, but personally I think that was a moment where I thought, this is a book I'm happy to be writing, like, and it's a book that I feel like tonally is much darker than my other books. My previous book was about, like a plague like hitting a city, in 2000. I wrote it in 2018, and I thought that was dark. But this one is like darker, in some ways, and so it surprised me that I would write a book like that.
I have to add that the plague was prescient, unfortunately.
Yeah.
If you wrote it in 2018. Okay, so I have a couple questions actually. What do you distinguish as Canadian literature from American literature?
I think a lot of Canadian literature, like a lot of American literature talks about America, like, and because America is like the richest country in the world, like people care about that. Like, you're writing a Canadian book that talks about Canada, you're really limiting your audience to Canada,
Mhm.
like, and maybe whoever, is a scholar of Canadian literature outside of Canada. I think the biggest difference. And as a result of Canada not being a sexy topic, I think you have a lot of people like or Canadian writers setting their books outside of Canada or disguising their Canadian books in other places.
Mhm.
Uh, I would think, like a lot of Canadian writers, Canadians have really excelled with like short stories, like I think about Alice Munro, our only Nobel laureate, unless you count Saul Bellow, which I don't. And
Mhm.
he was born in Quebec.
Yeah.
And Mavis Gallant is the most published writer of fiction to ever appear in the New Yorker, has published the most stories. And she was born in Quebec. And other writers whose names escape me right now are story writers. Margaret Atwood just published a story collection. It's great.
Mhm.
Alistair MacLeod, Alexander MacLeod, great. Irish Canadian writer Colin Barrett, I think, is really great. I would say the big thing about not writing about like Canada the same way Americans write about America would be the biggest difference for me.
Interesting. I have to plug in Monroe's Books in Victoria. It's a wonderful shop.
Oh yeah,
Please go visit. It's one of the best bookshops in the world, I think.
it's beautiful. Yeah, I agree.
Yes. Okay, I have another question. It says your books have spanned many different genres. How do you decide on a new topic? And what's the oddest inspiration that has struck?
Oh, that's good. How do you decide on a new topic? Like I think when I was younger, I just kept flinging ideas like against the wall, and whatever stuck and whatever was interesting to me uh stuck. Because like as a young man, like I was like a freelance writer. I was like I wrote newspaper and magazine articles like for about slightly over a decade. And that's the only way I made a living. And I don't think you can do that anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe if you're like a high end New York magazine writer, you can still kind of do it, but it's a sinking ship. And and so I was always trying to like turn some sort of random sort of spark of inspiration into like a byline, into like a fee. Um, I would say, but probably like the oddest inspiration was like I was at the racetrack with a friend, and he was just talking about these like dollar figures next to horses, and he said to me, like, you know what, you could buy a horse for $5,000, like right now if you wanted to, like for, and like I had this little light bulb where I was like, I'm gonna buy a racehorse and write a book about it, and that was like that ended up being a book for me in 2012, my year of the racehorse. That might be the oddest one. I probably have something that's odder or stupider that has escaped my imagination, my memory right now, like in terms of like a newspaper article or something like that. But that's definitely in terms of the books, the one that is the funniest.
That's interesting. Um, well, I think we're about out of time, but Kevin, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. And everyone, thank you for joining us.
Everyone, thanks for attending. Like it's a nice audience. I see some familiar names, and especially my cousin Jan. Thank you for coming. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I enjoyed as much as I enjoyed it. Thank you, Michael.
Hi, cousin. The Double Life of Benson Yu. Please make sure you buy it because you will not be disappointed. Thank you, everyone, and good night.